We're ready.
Can everyone hear me all right? Yes. Well, welcome. Thanks again for coming out. So this presentation titled Caring for Your Family Treasures, so this is me, Natalie. Like Heather just introduced, I'm an archivist at the Enoch Pratt Library and at the Central Branch, which also serves as a state library resource center. So not only serve the city of Baltimore, but also the state of Maryland. So some quick introductions. Again, I'm Natalie. Here I'm a librarian and an archivist, kind of do wear two hats there, and I work in our Special Collections Department, which is housed at the Central Library in Baltimore. So we are a by appointment, non-circulating closed-text area of the library. We hold the library's unique historical collections, such as the Edgar Allan Poe collection, the H.L. Mencken collection, all of the rare books that the Enoch Pratt Library has, housed in our department. And we have various other collections from local management figures. We have fine arts and visual materials, word posters, just a whole lot. Basically, anything that doesn't fit in your traditional library departments, if it's historically relevant, usually comes to us in special collections. We talked about the Enoch Pratt Free Library and State Library Resource Center at the Central Library. That's just a picture of our reading room. So, like I said, we're by appointment. You can always come to the Central Library, but for our department in particular, we encourage appointments just so we can make sure we have the right materials. Because we work with so many rare materials, as I'll talk about later in the presentation here, it's important to move those slowly and with caution. So I do just want to go over some agenda items with considering family treasures and how we want to protect them. So I end up start with some basic archival vocab, just because I'll be using some words throughout the presentation. Just want to make sure we all have the same definitions. And also wanting to narrow down and define what we mean when we say family treasures, because that can mean a lot of different things for different people. So we'll review material types and formats, talk about the risks and damages that are possible, and then cover some preservation, storage techniques, best practices, those kinds of things. And then I also like to talk about ways you can then share those family treasures, because I think it's a shame people want to pour all this love and work into keeping these treasures protected, but then they just end up still sitting in the box. A happy collection is used collection. And then I'll just link more resources, and I have some handouts as well for the end. And then I do want to save all questions for the end. So if you do have some questions, if you could just hold them to the end, I'll open it up at the end. And then generally at the end of this, I hope you'll be able to identify your family or family's treasures if you're working with different collections. Have the ability to create a preservation, rescue, and storage. Understanding preservation needs for various different formats. And then just to know some of the tools and resources that are available. Some are paid, but a lot of them are also free. If you're willing to kind of roll your sleeves up and do some of the preservation yourself, you can do quite a lot with some free resources. So like I said, we're going to jump right in. Do have a lot. So vocabulary, this list could go on and on and on, to be honest. That's the source for the National Archives. So I highlighted the words and put them in bold for the ones that I think are particularly important, as they're the ones I'll be saying a lot. So when I say access, all I'm really meaning is who gets the right to actually see the materials. So for personal family collection, that's usually kind of to the families to decide. But when you start thinking about papers going into institutions, you do want to think about, are any of the people in the paper still living? Do we need to protect their information? So that's where you need to come up with an access plan. Appraisal, kind of a familiar word, what something might be worth, both dollars and just sentimental value. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. Archival just means related to archives. And arrangement is just a fancy word for organizing. So when you're putting your collection together, it's a good practice to describe what you're arranging in the ways you're doing it. So are you keeping all the photos separated together, or are you keeping photos connected with their original? Noting that an arrangement just helps folks use your collections. Conservation, and I'm going to also jump to preservation because I like to use those two together. Conservation is our actual effort to restore items. So you can think of it as like pay or rewind on an item. If you have a painting that's the same damage, you can work with art conservators and they can help restore a painting. Preservation is more just hitting pause. So you may have some damage or some items that you're concerned about, but you're putting in effort to preserve them and stop any further damage. Description is just what is the thing? I'll talk about that a lot, especially in the initial beginning when we talk about making inventories. Because when you talk about descriptions, you can say, I have a box of photos, Or you can say I have a box of photos from 1940s. That can help someone doing research because they know, okay, this box actually might have the photos I'm looking for, rather than going through like 7 boxes of photos you just did not need to spend that much time going through. And then metadata is just data about data, essentially. So it kind of goes hand in hand with descriptions. Metadata is really important for that discovery element. Again, if you're looking, you need photos from the 40s. If you have that metadata on those photos, you know exactly where to go to those ones instead of having to go through all the boxes of photos. Then provenance, it is just the chain of where the stuff kind of came from. So our example is the Edgar Allan Poe collection. We have really good provenance in that we know the hair of Edgar Allan Poe that we have in our collection is his hair because it came directly from his niece, Amelia. So we have the provenance record tracing exactly where that item came from. So going through, as you're working on your own collections, there's a lot of questions you'll end up asking yourself while you're working on these collections. So the big one, why do you want to save these family treasures? Is it just for personal use within the family? Or like I said, are you going to be looking to an institution? Who will need that access? How long will the records need to be saved? Will they be transferred? What is the purpose? So these questions can be kind of nebulous and maybe difficult to answer, but I do think they're important ones to reflect on when you do have a collection of materials, because it'll help guide you with the choices you make for whether you do want to invest in conservation or just work with preservation. How much do you want to order for supply? If you already maybe have a plan. Are there tweaks you need to that plan? So these questions I think are just important to reflect on so you know why you're doing what you're doing. So what are family treasures? Does anyone want to throw out some suggestions? I already made a few. I get to jump back. Basically, a lot of things can be considered family treasures: documents, photos, tapes, CDs, old books, letters, film reels, textiles, paintings, china, porcelain, all sorts of things can be considered. Yeah. So there's definitely a lot. And with all of these different types of treasures, it can feel overwhelming. And also, this is where those questions can come in hand in terms of, deciding, do you have the time and funds to get all your tapes digitized and create digital audio files? Or is it maybe better to just invest in a high quality tape player so you can listen to it? So going through and asking yourself these questions and reflecting on what you actually have will also help. And what I think is probably the best place to start when presenting family treasures. Just another list example, which is identifying an inventory. Knowing what you have, like I said, can be your best starting point. It'll help you determine if you do need to order supplies or go out to the store and purchase some, sleeves or folders, how many do you need actually to get. You'll know where things are actually stored, and also knowing how much stuff you need, you'll know how much space you'll need for shelving. So this has happened in many an archive where they just can no longer accept donations until they start clearing things out because there's just no shelf space anymore. So and I think with digital also, it's easy to think you have limitless storage and we can always store the digital things, but having a storage plan for your digital files is also important. I'm a big believer that any inventory, like getting just a box of stuff versus a box of stuff that has a list of what's in it written by someone who went through it, can be a little bit easier to work with. And same with description of items, having some sort of description, like I said, even if the photo just says 1940, that can really help, because having a photo with no date on it, that's when you start getting into, well, I can see this car in the background, but then this car was manufactured at this date, and you can start there. Versus putting some sort of description, even if you're someone down the line might really appreciate that. And as an archivist who gets a bunch of stuff, I definitely appreciate when people have experience. And the thing about inventory is you can really use any tools, from anything like using Microsoft Excel or Word or Google, or even just using a notebook. So this image is actually from the Historical Society of Maryland. They have a collection of, it was like a local nature group that was taking photos of birds, and they just kept this handwritten ledger of all the photos of the birds they were taking. So when the digitization team went to go match the metadata, they had this written record You could just use it, and it works really well instead of just getting a bunch of photos of birds. So even as something as simple as just pen, paper, and a notebook can do a lot to help. So materials and formats, we're going to keep moving through. Like I said, we have quite a bit of material. One thing I do want to spend time thinking of, I already mentioned it, but the difference between physical and digital records, especially in 2025, it's hard to think of them as totally separate. I mean, just even how many family photos and family treasures you might have on that little thing in your pocket. It's important to think, like, are there photos on there that you do want to make sure to get printed at a high quality to preserve them as a physical format, or do you have a digital backup plan? Are you making digital copies of physical items and kind of going vice versa? Do you have 4 digital records, like high quality digital photos you want to print? Just want to kind of think about both. I'll go through this part a little more quickly just because rather than going through each individual material, I think it's a little bit more important to spend time on how to preserve these materials. So with materials and format, and in terms of physical items, books, we're thinking about pages and binding, whether it's stitched or glued, anything like that. Paper, the only thing I want to mention, and if you've worked with historic documents, you may have noticed this. Pre-industrial paper, so paper made prior to industrialization of using wood, is actually really stable because they use more linen rags, and that process didn't require no chemicals. So if you have really old paper, it's actually probably really stable and doesn't need as much attention as something like post-industrial paper. Once the paper making switched to wood, the wood pulp needed more chemicals. That's where we get those really dry, brittle pages. So controlling your storage of those pages can help them last a lot longer because their lifespan is just going to be shorter based on the way they were made. Newspapers, periodicals are particularly victim of the cheap paper because they were printed in mass to be used very quickly to do the modern day news, but we now know newspapers are some of the most historical pieces of information. Moving through common materials, also have scrapbooks, which hold ephemera. That can be anything from letters to old postcards and photos in one page of materials. Postcards, and greeting cards. Maps are often in collections, and then photographs are just a whole different world. You can do a whole presentation on just how to preserve photographs, because whether it's a film, a daguerreotype, tintype, whether you're working with negatives, prints, what type of photo paper, or liquid digital paper, photos, all sorts of things. Other types of material to consider with audio materials, you could have cassette tapes, LP records, reel tape, DATs, CDs, all sorts of things. Similar with video, whether you have 16mm film reels, VHS tapes, DVDs, Blu-rays, there's just a lot. Other things too, artworks, textiles, and then objects. So with all these different types, they're just things to think about of like what you might value as part of your treasures in your collection. With digital, a lot of it overlaps. Documents are still something valuable you want to preserve, but the preservation plan you're going to make for like a Word document isn't necessarily going to be the same as like a paper document you have. So digitized versus born digital will also kind of skew that a bit. So a digitized animal is like if you have a physical photo that you've scanned, you now have a digital copy of that. Born digital records, though, are things like a document you made in Word that started digitally, it was digital. You may print it, but its original form was digital. And those, again, you have so many more formats that you're considering too. So with all these materials, they do all carry some risks and concerns, particularly for damage and decay. These are just some very sad examples of all the things that can go wrong, whether it is scratches on CDs, glass breaking, bindings failing, tapes getting destroyed, just sadly molds, which is a real concern. So in thinking about these treasures, I do want to kind of also touch on some of the risks because that'll also really help with making your plans for how you want to protect the things. So common risks to consider. Number one is definitely water, and I'll get more into that. Other ones are fire, light, which is really common. Just light damage adds up over time. Dirt, bugs and pests, just physical harm with dropping stuff. Like I said, we're by appointment because we don't want to drop the nice stuff we have. That is one of a kind. Mishandling of materials, especially with rare books or old papers. If someone's just kind of using the paper really sort of casually, that's where we can see breaks and tears. With digital, we can also see incompatibility issues. You can also kind of see it with physical, but with digital, it's a big issue where you have old photos that were in a different file format that if you don't have the software to re-access those photos, you kind of have to do this 12-step system to try to get back to those files. And in that, you can run the risk of file corruption and data loss. Not all of these risks do apply both digital and physical materials, because if you have a hard drive and you drop it, it's still doing a lot of damage in the same way you have a piece of glass and you drop it and it shatters. So I do want to spend some time on one because it is the most common damager of items, whatever they are. You have the basic environmental risks, especially here in Maryland, closer to the city, especially over near water. Humidity can just cause your pages to curl. It can also just create a damp environment where that's you start seeing mold growth. And then you have the emergency risks of flooding, pipe bursts, leaks, that kind of stuff. So if you just run a lot of damage, especially to paper, because it'll just warp it, crinkle it, it can dissolve inks, you start leaving stains, and then it also can help create that environment where you are seeing mold and other growths occurring. Now, it can be treated by freezing materials. So if you do have something that gets water damage and you're really concerned, there is a way to control it. But it is also worth noting that once it happens, there's only sometimes so much you can do without working with a dedicated conservator to really restore an item. Fire is also a big concern, as it is the most destructive. If something is fully burned, obviously there's nothing we can do about it. But smoke and soot are also worth considering, because even if something takes some smoke damage, they can get that dust particles in there and that can start rubbing its pages and causing a lot of issues as well. Light damage is particularly important for like photographs and documents, because as those documents keep getting hit by light, whether it's room light, sunlight is particularly damaging, it'll just fade out color. If you've seen old newspapers that have sat in the sun, when they were first printed, they were nice and white, and then they turned yellow by sometimes in the afternoon they were printed. And that's just light damage. So light just has the ability to take down stuff. And dirt in general, no one likes dirty books or dirty photos and stuff, but the other issue that you have to consider is, number one, it does have the risk of attracting pests. But you also, like I said, you can get grit in that dirt in between the pages and photos, and as you're moving boxes, it starts to rub through, and that's where you can start seeing like holes in documents and things. It's just that bit of grit started rubbing through the pages and things like that. See a bunch of weird stuff when you process collections. Bugs and pests can definitely cause huge problems. Bookworms, definitely, although you would think they'd be a little friendlier, they will eat through entire pages. Bed bugs can infest a whole collection. And then rodents and larger pests can also just start eating materials and leaving more mess. And then physical harm is handling, like I mentioned, a lot of folks do pull books off by the spine, but as you get to older, rarer books, as their spines fail, because the spines are the most likely thing to fail on a book, rather than especially older pages, it'll just rip right off. So you just want to use careful handling. But books aren't the only thing. Photos, a lot of folks won't wear gloves when they're holding photos. So if there's oils on our hand that can react with the photo and start creating some smudges and decay, especially on like old photos. Talked a little bit about this. So reviewing all the water, fire, like dirt and bugs and pests, that does still all apply for digital media. As that example of that CD, if you scratch a CD and it gets totally scratched up, whatever was saved on it, you might not be able to access. So you still want to think about preserving those CDs and things like that, because you may have important information. Incompatibility issues, I did just touch on. I mostly think of it as a digital concern, because that's the technology is moving so much faster, it crops up more regularly. So documents from 7, 8, 9 years ago might not open in the same way that they did, and once you get those weird formatting changes, you can potentially start losing some original information. But older technologies like VHSs, CDs, DVDs, if you don't have players to run those, you're still kind of in the same boat. And then file corruption, that can happen from any sorts of things. I have enough tech information to know when it's happening, but not enough to fully describe it. But the big concern is that it leads to data loss. So it's not all gloom and doom, I promise. There are things we can do. So what can be done? This is where we kind of get into the preserving and saving those treasures. So preservation steps like properly storing photos in appropriate sleeves, getting books in encasements so that you can grab those encasements rather than receiving the books to get further damage. Encasing things in Mylar is really helpful. As you see, those old maps, using archival quality stored in climate controlled areas. That will really help keep documents within boxes safe. And then keeping a backup plan for your digital materials. So those are just a few examples, but we'll go more into them in detail here. So the biggest thing for saving your family treasures and really keeping them protected as best you can is going back to that inventory, knowing what you have in the first place and keeping that up to date. So if you know you have 40 photos and you see one box that has been maybe hit by some water or something, you might know, oh, well, there are only 15 photos in that one. So trying to triage that. But that inventory can help you know where the things are and how to respond to it a lot quicker rather than trying to go through a bunch of things. Because sometimes, depending on the damage, time is the essence. So you do want to get to those items as fast as you can. Being prepared, so having a plan and a backup. Institutions will always have some sort of safety emergency plan of the worst case scenario of your basement totally floods and all those historic records get damaged. But you can create a small scale version of that for your own collections. That can be really important if you do have those emergency situations. Preservation, conservation, I did talk about. That can be really depending on the materials, what your goal is with the items, whether you want to stick with just preservation or go that conservation route. Some folks, depending on their idea, really do want to make sure that conservation happens. And then protecting and securing the items once you've gotten them into a more stable state. You want to house the materials in appropriate containers and folders and make sure the items are secured in a stable environment. And I will go into that in a little bit more detail because there's some things that seem like common sense, but even us archivists can make mistakes. And then storing safely. So they're stored in a safe and responsible location, the items, and ensuring that you always have enough space to either add items to the collection or ensure you're not overstuffing things into a certain spot and foreseeing some damage. So having a plan, big key points with that is you do want to prioritize. You have some items that are whether more valuable monetarily or some that can just sentimental. Let's say you have some papers or letters, but you also have some photos. If you prioritize those photos when you're making that plan, having that prioritization chart really helps of knowing what you want to get to first. The emergency response plan and recovery plan will kind of go hand in hand because your emergency response would be those first initial actions to protect what you can, and then recovering as much as you can. So that backup plan is going more in detail with it. The more you can back up materials in various formats and in different locations is a great layer of protection. So that with digital materials, that's really common. You might have one document saved somewhere, but let's say you print it, you have a physical copy now. Well, if something happens with that digital file, now you do have at least that physical backup in hand to work off of. You can do that with Facebook also. If you have one photo of something, you can maybe take a digital copy of it and then make other copies printed again. So you have those additional backups. Having that backup, like I said, just as this kind of fail-safe option so that if something does get damaged, you maybe have that additional access point to the information. So this is what I talked about of like worst case scenarios. You come in and your whole basement's flooded. This was in Belgium. But they did have an emergency plan in place. They were able to put all the materials and work through, creating digital scans, creating the best facsimiles off of what they had, because they had that plan in place. So these links, and I can share these as well, but just to give an example, so the Northeast Document Conservation Center. I'm probably on this site at least 2 to 3 times a week. They actually have like direct hotlines you can call. So with this, if y'all work even with like institutions like local churches, anything like that, if they ever have issues with records or basement floods and all their historic records are damaged, these hotlines anyone can call and they'll offer some consultation. Now there are some fees, but they'll also offer some free resources as well. So this is the Northeast Document Conservation Center. So I was like just pointing out that resource because in those emergency situations, if your collection looks like that, it can be very overwhelming. So having that like moment of calm and knowing there's experts out there who can help is definitely good. So I did cover this a bit, but yeah, prioritizing, deciding what needs the most immediate attention for preservation, preservation versus conservation, deciding what works best. Because again, with conservation, it can get really costly because you do have to bring in specialized experts for that. And then AV, digital materials, those you may have to work with third-party vendors because they do require so much specialized equipment for restoring them or preserving them. So I'm talking about supplies, because we're going to get more into like technically preserving items here. You can get archival quality. We use these three vendors: Gaylord Archival, University Products, and Archival Products. I even brought some samples of some of the stuff they made, so folks can kind of get a feel for that at the end of this. But I will say they're very expensive. A box of folders from them is probably at least $10 more than like a box of folders from just like an Office Depot. But when you're looking at the difference between archival quality and common supplies, archival quality is manufactured to the standard of making sure it's lignin-free, acid-free, dye-free, so it's higher quality materials and that there aren't going to be chemical reactions with other things that you might be adding. So some of the like plastic sleeve protectors that folks use for binders, sometimes those plastics aren't manufactured to the same way like the archival mylar is. So that vinyl plastic can start to decay, and if you put photos in there, they can start like binding to the photo ink. That's kind of a really specific example, but that's just kind of the difference as to why the archival stuff is that bit more expensive. It is specialty designed to last and not damage materials. And then just basic supplies around the house, also that you might have gloves for working with photos. You might also find records that are a little bit, like I said, dirt can get into collections. So having gloves just for yourself as well, not just protecting the materials, come in handy. Basic staple removers, erasers, X-Acto blades. Like you can use a lot of really basic drafting and like drawing materials or like craft material to help get your process through the collection. So protecting the family treasures. So I have a few examples and photos here. So to protect them, store your treasures, like I said, in the acid-free folders, helps keep them safe. Preservation materials also serve as protective barriers. So as you see, you can pull out the original documents and have them out on folders, but when they're all in the box, all in those folders with the bond paper to offer that extra bit of protection, if that box was closed and someone spilled their coffee, okay, my box maybe got some coffee stains, but the original documents didn't because there's box material, folder, and bond paper. So there's 3 layers of basically protective material that has to fail before it gets to your document. So even just doing this can make a huge difference in helping your materials last a lot longer. Storing them safely in stable environments with secure locations, not that old shelf that maybe is a little rickety, and making sure you have plenty of space available for them. And for digital protections, again, at multiple formats, using cloud storages, but wanting to look through and make sure you read through the access usage policies. So the stable environments, since I've said that a few times, up in the right there, I did put your optimal ranges. So 50 to 65 degrees is pretty tolerable for almost most collections. With more extreme situations of, like if you have already damaged photo negatives that need to be in cold storage, you might need a specialized fridge. But that is a specific situation. And then humidity, anything between 30 and 50% is good. If you're hovering over that like 55 into the 60 realm regularly, that's where you can run into the like things starts getting a little damper than you might want. Then low indirect light is also really important because again, that light damage. When you're deciding on where you're going to maybe storing them, it's important to consider potential risks, especially with water or pests. So active lived-in spaces, so like a closet, or if you have like just like a office area, those can actually be a lot better and safer because although people are going in and out of them a lot, that means if there's something wrong, someone will notice it a lot sooner. But it's also, they're more likely away from unstable environments like attics, where you're getting just a lot more access from pests and things, and basements, which you have a huge risk of water damage since water tends to flood in basements. So with paper, things to consider when you're protecting that. Whenever possible, you do want to remove metal fasteners. They can just get really rusty and start ripping through pages and causing damage. So If you can safely remove metal fasteners, always do that when you can. Whenever possible, you want all your papers folded just completely flat. Over time, any folds in papers will cause basically strains in the fibers, and that's where you get those breakage points. You can repair those, but like mylar sheets will create enough static electricity. You can kind of piece the pages together without adding an adhesive, because adhesives can be kind of damaging for papers as well. And then, oops. When possible, you do want to keep pages separated because inks on paper to interact with them. And again, having those extra buffered sheets can also help take any hits if damage does happen. And then, like I said, with the mylar, you can actually put pieces of paper back together without using any sort of adhesive. So with books, any sort of bibliographic information you can get out of the books is really important. That'll help both you knowing what book you have, but also if anyone is going to maybe need to use your collection, if they know you have that book, it can help. Papers, like I said, for the most part, book paper is pretty okay. Some of the like cheaper made paperbacks, you can get some paper treatment done so the acidification of those kind of yellow brittle pages can be controlled. But it's kind of up to you whether you want to invest that much into that. And then binding, most often not, like I said, that is the first thing that's going to fail. So depending on the book you have, you may want to get a professional bound, which is definitely an option. But a lot of folks also like to just go with encasements. With these photos, I tried to just show different ways you can encase books. So you can get these really robust total like flaps that are also 4-fold over, or it's just a 4-fold over, or it's just 2/3 covered, or you just wrap it in paper. So there's a lot of ways you can encapsulate a book to help keep it safe. Periodicals and newspapers. Some of the best practices, honestly, making copies onto more stable formats, like more stable acid-free papers, encasing them in mylar where you can, but also creating digital copies. Just because newspapers were just really not truly made to last. They were just made to be quick, out the door, printed that day, sometimes multiple times a day. So I always recommend creating copies in any way, whether you want to do physical or digital, and then encasing them in some way to help prevent any further decay. But with newspapers and periodicals, sometimes you have to accept that there will be a bit of decay going on just because of the way they were manufactured. Scrapbooks. I will spend a little bit of time on these because these are very common items in family treasures. I think a really handy way to kind of tell a great story because you can combine the letters and photos. But what happens when you combine newspaper clippings, letters, photos, now you're, where I just have 4 different slides for each individual format, you've combined all those things into one, and each one needs a different sort of preservation plan. So when possible, if you can separate things off of adhesive, you definitely want to do that, just because adhesives will just kind of keep reacting within the materials. So if you can get those off, great, but sometimes if you're trying to remove an adhesive, you may notice, if you start noticing the damage to the original, just leave it, make a copy, because it's not worth any damage the adhesive is going to do, is much worse. So this is an example of one that has a bunch of newspaper clippings glued. So if we were trying to pull those off, they would just completely shred and look terrible. So rather than doing that, we've scanned these and then added in just interfiling paper, because that paper can absorb some of the chemical bleed out and the acid that's coming out of those pages. That way it's absorbing that rather than the 2 pages of newspapers touching each other and just decaying each other even further. This is just another example of where some of the items have been pulled out, but where we couldn't, we just made a copy. Because we tried to pull out those IDs, they were just causing, we decided it was way too much of a risk, so we just left them in the original scrapbook. And making those copies can just get you a version of. So, for example, if a researcher wanted to come and see these, I could just pull the copy of that, unless they really needed to see the original, whether it was for like the material that it was made out of, then they can see the original. But rather than having to pull out a full scrapbook, I just have this copy as well. But cards and postcards are pretty durable. They were designed to be folded, so their paper does have some more reinforcing, but when you can store them flattened, it does help. And then just they have so much ink on them, interleaving papers will help. And again, you can always encase things in mylar. Maps and other large pages, or if you have old architecture, If you don't have the big handy flatbed storage drawers like we have in archives, which most people don't have because they're kind of big and cumbersome and expensive, the next best thing you can do is actually roll them, because that won't create any of those fold points to create stress in the paper. So what this individual is doing is rolling the paper with an additional acid-free piece of paper. So as it curls into that scroll style, it has that bonding paper to help absorb any further damage. You're not introducing those creases, and then it can be stored in a secure, like cardboard reinforced acid-free tube. That'll help keep it much more secure. Photographs. This is probably one I get the most questions on. So I'll spend some time on this. Photographs. Because photo technology, and it's still changing every day, but especially the early technology, whether you had glass negatives, tin types, daguerreotypes, there were just so many different types of chemical processes used. Each individual negative you might have may have a specific need that's a little bit different. So like with glass negatives, we often are just putting them in some sort of cardboard flat enclosure because it needs that extra support. Whereas just like photos on photo paper, usually a mylar sleeve with an additional acid-free paper sleeve. And that paper sleeve is opaque, so it just helps reduce the light damage because photos are so much more sensitive to light damage. Mm-hmm. When you are working with photographs, you do always want to wear gloves, like I mentioned. There's just oils in our hands that can create smudges. On some old photos, you can actually sometimes see old thumbprints from people holding them. Sometimes it happens in the development process. So someone just used their hands for developing the photo, they just leave their mark right in it. And then with photos, digitizing them can be really handy because you create invaluable backups, but it's also a really good, easy way to share them because photos can be, like if you have an original photo, you're often I'm at least hesitant to ever want to send it in mail or anything like that. A digital version can be a great way to share them. But then you also can create metadata when you scan them. So sometimes you get photos that have these lovely, handy notes where they're written in the back, that people are labeled, you know, who's who, and it's great. Other times you just get like a photo, and like I said, you just got to figure things out. So when you scan, you can start creating some metadata, but also whenever you have some metadata, whether it's written directly on the back, which isn't always great, what you can do is copy that information down separately so you still have a record of it. And with just one other note on writing directly on the back, you don't want to obviously rub any of that ink off. Just know that sometimes if you are writing on the back of photos, the inks can get through the backs of the paper and start getting into one's photos. So if you have any photos where you are creating metadata, I always recommend like either sticking it on the side or putting it in a folder that's just separate, but that's still storing the photo. That way it's not putting anything directly on the picture itself. With AV materials, these are really sensitive to temperature. So storing them in a cool, dry, stable environment becomes very important because the polymers of the tape can break down if they're exposed to too many environmental factors. So you do want to store tapes individually in protective sleeves. Don't touch the film. Don't try to like get it out of the tape in any way. Just you run too much risk of damage for doing that. Handling discs or anything by the edges, if there's a sample, a label, anything like that. Light exposure is damaging to these, but the bigger thing is also to consider is magnets. So if you have like a bunch of old tapes and things, you're storing them near like your big old DVD player or near a TV or just something where you know there's a lot of electronics that have magnets in them. You just want to be very careful because those magnets can speed up any damage, or it can just totally wipe data off of those because magnetic tape uses magnets to record the information. If you start introducing more magnets, you can start creating a lot of issues. Artworks and objects. This is really, I put one example, but truthfully, this is one where you have to go individual item by individual item because each item will have its unique needs. For framed items, I am a believer if the frame is not damaged and it is actually sealed well and the item's mounted properly, you can keep them in the original frames. If you notice the frames are damaged or if there's anything going on with the frames, that's when you need to kind of consider pulling some things out, maybe rehousing them in some sort of way. I do always like to suggest keeping things wrapped in acid-free paper rather than anything like bubble wrap. Shipping materials, similar to those like plastic sleeves you can store documents in, the plastics they use aren't to that archival level, so you can get that plastic decay that creates like almost like a stickiness to the items because it's just the vinyl starting to melt and break down. So whenever you can wrap things in paper, it'll still offer that protection and that protective barrier. These were put in bags, but you don't have to put things in bags. Again, it kind of just depends on the items themselves. The biggest thing I always like to remind folks, because I've been guilty of this, you can store multiple objects in one box if you happen to have like a smaller box or a mid-sized box, but always check that you can safely carry the item, because if it's an extremely heavy box and you're trying to move it, that creates a big risk of mishandling. And if you have 5 things that you're trying to keep really nice and they all drop at once, it's not going to be very pretty. So always make sure you're packing boxes in an appropriate way where they're not getting overloaded, but they can still be safely moved. Textiles, because some folks, they have quilts and things like that, or if there's an old dress or suit that has a lot of importance to you, you always want to try to make sure they're clean prior to storage. If it's kind of like with adhesives, if putting them to a cleaner, whether it's dry cleaning or cleaning them yourselves, runs the risk of damage, it's not worth that. But if you have a safe way, or a safe way that you could clean it, again, sometimes dry cleaning can be really handy, but it just depends on the textile itself. You do want to store them clean, because again, if grit and dirt is in there, that can be really damaging the textiles, because again, once that gets all into the fibers, you get the loosening of the fibers, and it causes the items to kind of break down and damage. Whenever you can, again, you want to wrap things individually. Again, I'm a big fan of paper, and it tends to be pretty easy to find actually for like just even that tissue paper, as long as it's acid free and doesn't have dyes, that will work really well. And then just keeping them either, I think a vinyl bag is handy for that, because you don't want moisture getting on them. That can be just, again, a breeding ground for mold. So whenever you can add a barrier that will keep things dry, especially with cloth, that Mylar bag can be really safe. And then you can put them on books, or whenever possible, you do want to keep them stored separately and flat, because hanging things, you do strain and stress fibers over time. So even if it means a lot to you, if it's just hanging on a suit, just like a hanger, it can kind of sag and fold fibers over time. And then for digital treasures, I've talked about this a little bit, but I'll go through again. So with backing up, you just want to make sure you actually know how much storage you need or may need. So if you have a 2 terabyte hard drive and a 1 terabyte cloud storage account, maybe that would be enough, but maybe down the line, there's going to be more added. So it might be worth getting an additional hard drive that is 2 terabytes. Maybe you do actually need 5 whole terabytes. Because again, digital storage is not actually infinite. Although you don't see the shelf spaces, it is limited. Creating duplicate records also, like I said, whether it's in a cloud, on a hard drive, and a physical, 3 tends to be the best, but as long as you have multiple access points, because especially with cloud storage options, if anyone loses a password, or if depending on what company you use, if they change their policies, you do run that risk of you may lose access to things in the cloud. So I'm a big fan of, whenever possible, keeping your backups on like either hard drives or some sort of printed record, just so you always have that access point. With digital files, it's also important to keep them up to date, just to avoid those incompatibility issues. So whenever you're doing updates, definitely try to do a backup before, because updates are often when file corruption can occur, and data loss can be a big risk in those moments. So backing up your files before updating or transferring is really good practice, just to always have those records. And I said this already, but a way to think of it is the 3-2-1 backup rule. So you have places with 1 original. So 2 digital copies in 2 different spots, but you have 1 original somewhere else. So if you have that 3rd copy as a physical, just helps keep you covered. So the additional resources, like I said, I mentioned the Northeast Document Conservation Center. This one is fantastic if you do have those unique individual questions about items, because they have these preservation leaflets. And you can actually kind of go through and see specifically for root formats, reformatting, photographs, preparing the environment, and these are all freely available, and they do update these right now. They have it all broken down by type, so the Northeast Document Conservation Center is just a great resource if you have specific preservation questions. Another one I like to point out that's kind of similar, the Library of Congress also has a full page dedicated to preservation. And this is all also broken down by type. So collections care both like paper, photographs, scrapbooks, newspapers. So this will actually go through in much, much greater detail. So if you do have a big collection of comic books, Library of Congress actually has a full page dedicated to how you can best preserve those. And again, these are all free. You don't need to figure out all that information. And I have handouts with all that info as well, so you'll have access to those. So the last, I'll go through the sharing family treasures quick here. Like I said, I always like to include this just because I think, especially as someone who works in an archive who puts a lot of effort into preserving collections and getting them ready, and then they sit for like a year before anyone requests them, it's like, oh man. So we try to do displays and exhibits, but sharing your family treasures I do think is important because you're putting all this work in and saving these stories and sharing these narratives, and you want to be able to get them to people. So finding ways that you can share them with whether your family or groups, anything like that can be just really fun and engaging way to save in your collection. So I'll review sharing them, and then as part of sharing them, I think ongoing maintenance is a great hand in hand with that, because when you're interacting, you're catching errors or issues that might be emerging rather than them becoming these big issues. You may notice, like, is that moved on this one document? Let me pull this before it spreads into all of my documents. And with ongoing maintenance, we do also talk about reading, which is, again, kind of that example of mold. If you have like a threatening item, or if it's just an item, maybe you don't need 7 copies of that one photograph. Maybe it is okay to get rid of a few just so you have space to include more photos that are different. We call it de-accessioning. That's just the nice way of saying removing things from a collection. But then also consider, if you do have materials you're interested in donating to like an institution or anything like that, that's a great way to share them, but it's also a great way for you to kind of like really think through how you want to prepare caring for your treasures and collections. So with books, what you see that one on is a book cradle. If you've worked with rare books before, you've maybe seen them before. Basically, it's just a way for the book to sit more protected and supported. That's the biggest thing rare books need. Their binding just doesn't have the same strength and robustness that a modern book has when it's freshly made. So you just always want to make sure that you're holding them with a lot of support and care. With most rare books, you don't want to be wearing cloth gloves, although you see a lot of like images of folks using gloves. The reality is when you're using cloth gloves, you lose feeling of the really fine motor tactile sensations. So when you go to turn the page, it's actually a lot easier to rip the page with gloves on rather than just using clean hands. So as long as your hands are washed, you're more often than not fine. And then holding books, like, you don't want to do that hook off the shelf whenever you can. You want to hold them by their spines, or just basically going through and using 2 hands when possible and keeping them supported. Papers are really similar. You just want to handle them with care or using gloves. Mylar sleeves are a great way to let you keep pages within that sleeve, and you can still hold them and they're protected by that sleeve, because again, the static electricity will actually keep the page really secure. Photos, digitizing them is, I think, the easiest way to share them. But there's other things you can do, creating, photo albums where you're not putting adhesives directly on the photos, anything like that. These you do want to hold with gloves, just again, the oil of your hands. AV, if digitized, if you have the resources for doing that, I will say working with professionals that can do that can get costly, but it is a great way to create files that you can then easily share with folks. So those old VHS home videos, you can actually get a lot of great stuff off those if you have the high quality equipment and experts who can help you with that. Objects in art, securely hanging them from the frame, making sure you're using the appropriate hardware that follows the weight limit guidelines with those. If you are displaying items out, there's a stuff you can call museum putty that's not super expensive. Leaves no residue, and basically it is like this tacky material that you can put on the bottom of something and then put it to a shelf and it will help hold it. I mean, if someone really shoves it, it's gonna be enough. But it's called museum putty because museums do use it as a way to just add a little extra support to make sure their items don't go falling. And then using 2 hands, seek assistance whenever possible. And then the last few things, I'll talk about textiles. So again, keeping it clean. And then if you are going to be hanging, I would recommend only for like display purposes. This is a great example of a non-damaging because it's not puncturing holes to the fabric. It's not folding the fabric in any way. It's just gently grasping it so that it folds. Now, if you left your items hanging like that, you would notice sag over time. So if you are displaying them for a while and want to put them away, just make sure they get put away cleanly. But when you can hang them up, and it can be really nice to display some of those textiles. If you have clothing, sometimes mannequins can be a little expensive, but there's other ways you can kind of stage clothing as well. And then for digital, there's a lot of different ways you can host collections. You can either keep them private and use your own sort of in-house, like drive share, where you have a shared password that you give to folks. But you do still want to be kind of mindful of, again, those privacy policies and usage policies that the companies are using. You can also, though, work with external partners. So I will give a shout out to Digital Maryland here. If you do have a collection and you feel like it could be a great one to be shared more publicly, you can work with organizations like Digital Maryland that work with institutions, organizations, all sorts of folks across Maryland to just help host resources online for folks to access. This is a great resource. A lot of it is photos, but they'll also upload documents, things like that. We've worked with them just helping get our collections digitized. If you have materials that you're comfortable doing that with, what's great is you help with writing that historical narrative, providing resources to people, getting more primary resources accessible to folks. And it can just be a great way of sharing the resources and materials that you have. That brings me, yes. Right on. So I know I ran through a lot. So if there are any questions, I will happily take those now. Or if you have something specific in your collection that you want to know about.
This is a little odd. In our family, we've got some old stereopticon photographs that, you know, they're curved, they're double. And is there something special in the way you should handle those?
We actually have an example. We actually can put those in just Mylar sleeves individually because the curling is that adhesive got into the cardboard and just the warping of that. So there was enough moisture in the adhesive to cause that. So we have a stereoscope collection as well, and all of ours are like C's, basically. But to keep them preserved so that we can still bring them out for like school visits, they're pretty popular with kids. We keep them in individual Mylar sleeves. So each photo is sleeved, and then there's actually specific boxes you can get for them. But even like a shoe box would work. The nice thing about the specialized one is because they were designed specifically to house stereoscopes, they fit them perfectly and they give a nice tilt so you can actually go through them. So you see, archive stuff can be a little bit pricey, but if you have a really big collection that you really want to keep safe, it can be worth it to get these because they're really nice sturdy boxes. Like I said, they're designed specifically for that size. And then we've used just acid-free like tab cards to put them in between because we had so many just to break them up to say, these are photos of Egypt. These are photos from this area. These are just, we had so many of them just to break them up that way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Got 5 minutes. Great. By email, if you have questions, I have some cards if you'd like to grab them. You can always email or call the Special Collection Department. Like I said, we're the State Library Resource Center, so we'll help answer questions, help with research, anything like that. Help direct you into, if you don't have a record, we can help locate where it might be located and help you get to the right spot. And then, yeah, if you have any questions, like I said, I did bring some like examples of archive materials and some handouts, so you can come up to the desk here. But thank you all for coming.